Hi, this week we are going to be covering active reading and reading strategies. This is a carryover from the previous week where we discussed metacognition as a form of critical thinking. Now, critical thinking is going to be an important component as you learn new reading strategies. And this is because when you're practicing active reading, there are more strategies involved to promote deeper learning. So let's take a look. So there are two different reading approaches that we might use. The first is mindless reading. So with mindless reading, you're glossing over pages without putting much thought or responses into your reading. Sometimes we use this when we're reading maybe a magazine, a comic book, or maybe even a blog, where we're just kind of reading for fun. The other is active reading. When you're doing active reading, this involves use of more critical thought, which also uses techniques to fully engage with the text. So active reading is what we want to exercise or use when we're learning something new, especially for school. And to be able to understand what you're learning, we need to make sure we promote deeper learning. And deeper learning is what gets our neurons to work. If you recall earlier in the semester, we had a video regarding active learning where you were able to get a basic understanding of what that means. Now, in order to promote that deeper learning and get our brains to really work and have more of that long-term retainment of the information, we need to make sure that we use some strategies when we're learning something new, especially through textbooks or reading anything that is going to promote that active learning. Now, it does take a little bit more effort, but it will pay off in the long run, especially when you're preparing to do things such as writing a research paper or even preparing to take an exam. So again, mindless reading versus active reading. You just want to be aware of when you're using these two and make sure you're using them appropriately, especially when you're trying to retain information. Now, before we get into some strategies, let's get a basic understanding of what chapters look like when you're reading textbooks. Now, textbooks can sometimes be overwhelming, especially when you see the amount of content in each chapter that you have to read. In your textbook for this class, in chapter 23, it breaks down what we call the anatomy of chapters. So basically what to look for in each chapter and what is being covered. So normally you have what's called a key concept. That is what the chapter is focusing on. Then you have a main idea and a secondary idea with supporting details. So sometimes when we look at the breakdown of chapters in this way, we're able to feel a little less overwhelmed knowing that there are different parts that we can focus on and different parts that we can be aware of as we're learning new information. Now let's move forward. These next slides are going to cover different reading strategies at different points in your reading process. So we're going to start with how you can prepare before you engage in active reading. Now, as we go through these strategies, just know that not everything may work for you, or maybe you're already practicing these different strategies, but I do encourage you to pick maybe 2 to 3 to try in the next couple weeks. Maybe something new that you haven't tried before. So before you start reading, first of all, you want to check your mindset. So do a mindset check. Where are you at with approaching your reading? Do you have a positive attitude about it or a negative attitude about it? If it's the latter, you definitely want to replace the negative with positive. So realize that reading offers you access to a lot of information that's recorded throughout the knowledge of human race. And I know that sounds pretty big, but it's true. When you're reading, you are acquiring knowledge, and that's really important. And that's such a benefit that we have when we're reading anything. Second, create a distributed reading schedule. So this is important because, again, sometimes reading can be overwhelming, especially when you see the amount of content in a chapter. Sometimes we already feel defeated about the amount of reading that we have to do. But avoid those marathon reading sessions and cramming at the last minute, again, procrastinating. These are not helpful. Instead, spread out your reading into shorter sessions. That usually helps. Another thing that helps before you start reading is to review past readings, because this can help you connect your learning with previous information that you've already read about. Preview the chapter before reading. Sometimes this helps so that you can get an overview of what to expect. Again, look at the anatomy. What is the key concept, the ideas on there, and the supporting details. Sometimes looking at the headings also helps. Identify the purpose of what you're reading. So keep the big picture in mind and maybe ask yourself, what is the point of what I'm going to read? And how does this relate to your success in the class and what you need to know? And lastly, create a list of questions. So the process of reading does help you heighten your concentration. You're finding answers maybe to certain questions that you might have as you read. It does also create a way for you to be more actively involved in your reading and improves your understanding. So you're, again, taking that driver's seat, taking control of your reading. You're creating concepts for yourself to learn by creating questions and answering them after the reading. So after you've prepared for your reading, these are some strategies that you can try while you're reading. And again, pick and choose the strategies that are going to work for you. So first, you want to try reading in chunks. Good readers don't necessarily read all the words. Instead, they read ideas, which are often found in groups of words or chunks. Next, you might want to try concentrating on reading just a little bit faster. So there have been studies that found that students that increase their reading speed by simply concentrating on reading a little faster tend to gain more understanding of what they read. So you might want to try this, see if it works for you, and if not, that's okay. Again, you want to go at your own pace and make sure that you're absorbing the information. Take some time to pause and recite. So maybe at the end of each section in a chapter that you're reading, summarize out loud. The more difficult the reading is, the more that you might want to try this to make sure that you're gaining an understanding of what you're reading. Sometimes reciting it and saying out loud helps us to retain the information a little bit better. Now, if you created a list of questions before reading, you might also want to make sure that you're reading for answers to the questions that you created. And then go back and actually answer your questions. Next is marking and annotating your text. Now, I know that many of you might already be doing this. You might be highlighting, you might be taking notes on the side, but if not, this is an important strategy to try. Also, you want to be able to make sure that you're not overwhelmed by the amount of highlighting that you do, so make sure to limit it to important concepts and ideas. Taking notes also, as I mentioned, is another strategy. If you have not tried creating an outline yet when you're reading, that might be an effective strategy for you, just to have a visual of the different ideas and concepts. And you can break it down by the anatomy of the chapters, such as the key concept, write a little bit of notes about that, maybe the main and secondary ideas, and then the details. And then at the end, That can be something that you refer to instead of having to go back to the textbook. Next, look up the definition of key words. So maybe having a dictionary, your phone next to you, or something where you can look up definitions could be a handy tool in case you don't know the meaning of a word. And lastly is to read critically. So learn to read critically by asking questions about what you are reading, who wrote it, and what they stand to gain. Look for facts and evidence. So this is when you can employ your critical thinking skills. Now, what happens after reading? So there are still strategies that we can use after we finish reading a chapter. So some of these includes reflecting on what you read, and sometimes recalling key ideas from what you have just read can be a powerful learning strategy because you're going back and revisiting concepts again, retaining that information. Reread difficult passages. So sometimes we need to go back and read certain areas in a chapter that were a little bit more challenging for us to understand. So this is where your mindset is going to be really important because, again, when we face challenges, we don't want to give up. It's the power of that word yet. We haven't learned it yet. So go back, read those difficult passages, and make sure that you are doing whatever you can to understand that information. Next is reciting the marked text. So you can solidify your learning by going back to the text that you highlighted or annotated and summarize that. It's a good way to check your understanding. Talk about what you read. This is kind of a fun way of checking for your understanding. You can work with another person, maybe a classmate, a friend, or a family member, and try explaining the main ideas and supporting details of the chapter. And then check, did you understand that information in the same way? Sometimes when you are able to explain a concept, that means that you can actually teach it, which means you understand it. Next, read another book on the same subject. Sometimes gaining another perspective can help you explain the same ideas more clearly. And lastly, if you're still not understanding what you're reading, make sure to seek help. Talk to your instructor or maybe visit our success centers for some learning workshops, learning activities, or some tutoring. Never leave concepts unclear. That's the last thing you want to do. In this next slide, I just included some questions to ask yourself before, while, and after you read. So it's just a basic overview of some of the strategies that we went over, just to give yourself a quick checklist. So before you start reading, again, check your mindset. Are you employing that growth mindset or that fixed mindset? If it's the fixed mindset, you want to switch that and make sure that you're thinking more positively. Are you reading during a time that you're most alert? Have you previewed the chapters from beginning to end? While you're reading, check what you're doing. Are you highlighting, annotating, reading out loud, and asking questions? And after you read, how are you checking for your understanding? Do you reread, reflect, or talk about what you read and summarize? So again, I keep stressing this. The reading process, especially active reading, involves a lot of critical thinking. You're constructing logical arguments and you're asking probing questions. So let's look at some ways that we can ask probing questions. Now there is a process called the Reading Apprenticeship Approach, and this is born out of metacognition and a way for students to start applying that when they're reading. So the Reading Apprenticeship Approach uses the following skills and strategies. And this is important because you'll be using this for homework number 2. So metacognition, remember, is thinking about how you think. And it's thinking also about the way you think and learn. Thinking out loud strategies is actually practicing and demonstrating metacognition when you're reading. So this is when you're able to use what we call the talk to the text method. Talking to the text involves some thinking stems that we discussed last week. So you're going to use this for homework number 2. make sure that you use these strategies and go back to the lecture if needed.